I
really think that racing has always played a very important part in the development of the automobile as a whole. And from our earliest beginnings, we've always been full of enthusiasm for anything connected with it.
The home of the Porsche family in Feuerbacher Way, Stuttgart. The year is 1936. In this rare film, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche is seen supervising tests on the prototype Volkswagens. His son Ferry is also present.
During that period, I was in charge of the test department. Whenever we found a particular part that didn't come up to scratch, my father said, well, as long as you can make a saving somewhere else, then you can afford to improve it. My father also said that the Auto Union racing car, which we developed at the same time, was easier to produce than the Volkswagen.
A remarkable statement, considering that Dr. Porsche's Auto Union P wagons were probably the most ambitious and technically advanced race cars yet built. With their supercharged 4.5-litre V16 engines, capable of up to 180 miles per hour, about the only thing they had in common with the humble Volkswagen was their rear engine configuration.
Old Professor Porsche was no less than a god for us young drivers. He was for us what Ferrari was for the Italians.
Porsche's commission for the Volkswagen had come from Adolf Hitler. Ferry, driving, and Dr. Porsche accompanied the Führer. As always, the Porsches remained conspicuous by their lack of uniform. Despite the demands of Volkswagen production, they had never abandoned their own racing plans. This Volkswagen-based car, the Porsche Type 60 K10, was built for the Berlin-Rome race of September 1939. The race never happened, but this aluminium-bodied sports car is a clear indicator of what was to come. But racing ambitions were thwarted by the outbreak of war in Europe. In the chaos that followed, the French authorities made allegations against Dr. Porsche, resulting in 22 months' internment at Dijon. Ferry was working from Gmünd in Austria on a commission from Italy. This resulted in the Porsche Cisitalia, effectively an Auto Union derivative with four-wheel drive. The car was never raced. The Porsche Museum in Zuffenhausen, Stuttgart. Porsche number 1, a Type 356, was completed on June 8, 1948 at Gmünd. Although the 1.1-litre engine, suspension, gearbox and running gear are all pure Volkswagen, the engine is mounted in front of the rear axle. Porsche number 1 won its class in a road race at Innsbruck in July 48. The Zuffenhausen works have been home to the Porsche factory since September 1949, but things were different then.
It's probably worth mentioning that the whole of the racing department in the beginning was in an area which wasn't much bigger than this, just like a perfectly normal double garage. And in the front of it was a large, thick curtain with a sign saying, "No entry."
1951, and a class win for Porsche on their first Le Mans outing. Success was not always guaranteed, though. The car is successfully refueled, but the engine was still running, and after some discussion...
Sure enough, next time round he is black flagged and disqualified for this breach of regulations.
But just how important were these early races to Porsche?
Even today, I believe they are of the utmost importance, especially as regards raising sympathy for Porsche at large. and generating interest amongst the sports-minded people. Not only of young people, but the grown-up gentlemen as well, who could afford the cars. They certainly had an effect.
Baron von Hanstein and his colleague Richard von Frankenberg were able to use their aristocratic backgrounds to further the Porsche cause. Prince Metternich, Graf von Bergheim and Graf von Trips were all enthusiastic 356 drivers through the 50s. Interest in America was growing too.
Up until then, there hadn't been, since the war anyway, a German team taking part in any sports event there. And motor racing was beginning to get a foothold in America and was just starting to spread.
And so America began its love affair with Porsche.
Well, I now have the privileged experience of driving a 356A Carrera Speedster. This particular car is a 1500cc engine, and in this case has a very special 4-cam engine. Not too many of them were built. This car was basically seen in the United States, where it raced in the Pan America races and campaigned very early on in the SCCA series, which is one of the most foremost club and national series raced here in the United States. The car was very popular, as all Porsches were, because they were economical, they were reliable, and they were fast, and you won races. It's a little bit trickery, of course, driving this particular car, because of the sort of rear suspension the car has. If you turn in the corner nice and smoothly, everything is perfect. But if you arrive too fast, and you have to actually put some opposite lock on and back off the gas pedal as you're doing it, in that particular instance, of course, the car is inclined to stick its tail out, and if the back wants to come around, you get quite vicious oversteer. Here we are putting 6,000 revs down the straight. Car very, very smooth, sounds wonderful. What a pleasure it is to drive. Just listen to that engine.
Hermosa Beach, Los Angeles. Long-established dealer Vasek Polak remembers Porsche's image in the 50s.
You can drive the car to office, you can drive to store or wherever you work. And over weekend you drive to racetrack and race the car.
With an eye on the specials, built by their Frankfurt dealership Glockler, Porsche decided that a purpose-built race car was needed to keep up with the opposition. They came up with the 550. In 1953, at the Carrera Panamericana, the classic Mexican road race, Jose Araute won his class with a VW-powered 550 coupe. But for 54, Dr. Ernst Fuhrmann designed a new engine, an intricate flat 4. But why all the advertising?
I think I was the first person in the whole world who managed to tempt some money out of a sponsor. It was at the Carrera Panamericana, and his name was Mr. Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher wanted to go into the aviation industry using the Porsche Aero engine. I called this Fletcher fellow and said, "Look, you've got to help us. First of all, we'll give you great advertising by driving our Porsche car at the Carrera. You know, same company as your Aero engine. And secondly, we even write your name in big letters on our car." And so he said, "Right, I'll give you $1,000.
Von Hanstein's efforts allowed driver Hans Hermann to bring the 550 into third place overall.
You can't compare that race with any of the others. It was sort of similar in some ways to the Targa Florio, but Mexico was really more of an adventure because you were often left completely out on your own. In stretches of 400 or 500 kilometers, you might have only one emergency depot.
Hermann's success in Mexico prompted Porsche to adopt the name Carrera, from then on reserved for cars with special engines. The 30th of September of 1955 saw the death of film star James Dean when he crashed his 550 Spider on his way to a race meeting. But this did nothing to halt the Porsche fever sweeping America. The 12-hour race at Sebring. Von Hanstein gets his co-driver Herbert Linger to take the first leg. 2.5 hours later,
as I drove up to the pit, the mechanics told me that I had to carry on because Huschke was in a meeting with the race organizers. So I said okay and drove on for another 2.5 hours. At the next pit stop, von Hanstein was waiting. He jumped into the car, but he said he could only drive for half an hour because that's when his next meeting was due. Anyway, the 12-hour race at Sebring meant 8 hours driving for me.
Button. Everybody's got them.
Porsche had more than buttons to celebrate by 1956. 10,000 356s on the road and their 25th anniversary. At the end of '56, von Hanstein was sorry to see Wolfgang von Trips leave Porsche to join the Ferrari Formula One team. He was replaced by a young East German driver, Edgar Barth.
Well, I think my father was a total all-round driver because he started with cross-country motorcycles and then built his own racing engines in East Germany. Really, because of the circuits and the cars, you had to be more of an all-rounder back then. You were forced to do battle with the elements.
The successor to the 550 was known as the RSK. Von Hanstein realized that drivers of Formula One caliber were needed to get the best out of these cars. He therefore took on Jean Berra and Sterling Moss for the next season.
There was never anything in writing. We talked about it. We said this is what you can expect from Porsche. We'll pay your expenses, prize money is shared, and that was about it, really. There was no need for anything more.
Well, I know with Huschke that, you know, with the start money, you had to watch you got your portion, it didn't all go to him. Huschke was the team, if you like. He was the man you had to speak to, and he would dish out what he thought was right. And you had to sort of, you know, watch that you got your bit.
I always tried to find drivers whose breeding and background would more or less fit into the gentlemanly atmosphere at Porsche. I'm thinking in particular of Joachim Bonnier, who was certainly a very competent and quick driver, but others were faster. But Bonnier came from a first-class family, so he fitted in at Porsche.
Joe Bonnier was one of the best classified amateur-type driver. Probably his greatest forte really was that he was a thinking and intelligent driver, rather of the Graham Hill style, actually.
Open-wheeled bodywork was not compulsory for the Formula 2 season in '58. Hence the incongruous sight of Berra's RS Spider on pole at Reims. Porsche quickly decided to adapt the RS, producing an open-wheeled single-seater with 6-speed box. Rob Walker provided Moss with a distinctive blue car for 1960, and he had several wins. Class of '59 and a new kid on the block.
When I first went to Porsche, I expected this great Teutonic efficiency and everything was just so, and all the things that we were told to believe during the war. But as a matter of fact, it seemed more as though it was a family, a real team of good-natured, hard-working people that were not at all this propaganda image.
As we didn't have any money, as usual, we said, well, let's turn it to our advantage. We got an agricultural trailer attached to a Porsche tractor and drove it round the Solitude racetrack.
In 1960, new sports car rules prompted Porsche to produce new bodywork. With a variety of engines eventually reaching 2 litres, the RS60 and 61 models remain some of the most sought-after Porsche racers. But the 356 was still in the running.
The good thing about Graham, from my point of view, was that Graham was intelligent. He would take care of the car. He knew his limitations. He'd drive up to them. If I gave him the car in one way, he would usually come back in a very similar condition. He wasn't one of the drivers who was trying to prove that he was faster than everybody else.
Porsche invested a considerable amount of money in a Formula One contender for the '62 season.
So here we have the 804 chassis, into which Porsche designed the 753 engine. It was a 1.5 litre, horizontally opposed, air-cooled engine. It had 4 shaft-driven camshafts. It had 4 twin-choke Weber carburetors on it. And this little engine developed 180 horsepower at 9,200 revs. And I'm sure from time to time it was revved a lot higher than that. All this power was transmitted through a little 6-speed gearbox with limited slip differential. And of course the chassis was the typical Porsche chassis with tubular frame. Take a look at this. That is the fuel tank. And these drivers used to sit there in 40 gallons of petrol.
Van Gurney was competitive in the 804, but he couldn't quite match Graham Hill's BRM and Jim Clark's Lotus. He did win the French Grand Prix at Rouen, Porsche's first and only Formula One victory to date. Porsche pulled out of Formula One at the end of the '62 season.
I think they did the right thing. What they decided to do was not waste or utilize their best engineering talent, their best design talent on a Formula One car and use it on their real product instead. I'm sorry it happened, but I think they did the right thing. One of the early times that I was there in Mr. Huschke von Hanstein's office, one of his right-hand girls had a car problem, and he asked me, would I take her home? And I said yes. And to make a long story short, there was a sort of a traffic jam. Well, we're here right now, and this is our 25th wedding anniversary, and that's the same girl. So it was a very special thing for me.
The 911 was eventually launched at the Frankfurt show in late '63. But designer Butzi Porsche remembers the challenge of replacing the 356.
We wanted to modernize it. We just wanted, as best we could at the time, to try and make it a bit sleeker. They were still considering a 2+2, even maybe a 4-seater. There are prototypes which you probably know about. And of course, thinking about the 4-seater or even the fastback 2+2 was tricky. If you allowed for height, then the tail was no good. But if the tail was okay, then the height was compromised.
350,000 911s later, Butzi's design quandaries are long forgotten. As Porsche had now decided to adopt product-based competition machinery, Butzi's next job was to repackage the 911's 6-cylinder engine. The shapely 904 was the result, first of the so-called plastic Porsches.
The engine is very generous, revs up through 7,500, 8,000 revs, although it seems like it would like to go to 9 or 10,000, so I'm not about to try it. But it's very, very sweet, very beautiful little engine to drive, very torquey and very, very smooth. As you go through the corner, you can feel the car rolling a little bit from side to side, which of course, nowadays we have much stronger springs, much stronger roll bars, and of course a much stronger chassis. I'm running it up through the gearbox. I'm actually up in 5th gear now. I go down to 4th gear for this S's, sweep it through there. It's very, very smooth in fourth gear, accelerating hard out, braking quite hard here. Very, very smooth under braking, a little bit of downshifting there, down into third gear, and it is so smooth as you enter the corner and just picks up. It must have been a beautiful car to drive in races like the Targa Florio, Nürburgring, and places like that. Not for the Silverstones and the Hockentimes of this world.
The 904 was indeed a very nimble car and was particularly successful in the European Hill Climb Championship, a hugely popular spectacle in the 60s. The Targa Florio in 66. Davis and Mitter are piloting the ungainly 904 Spider, unkindly dubbed the Kangaroo. But the little 2-litre Porsche is only beaten by local hero Vaccarella in a 3.5-litre monster of a Ferrari. Meanwhile, the 911 underwent a baptism by fire and ice on the Monte Carlo rally.
All I can remember is that the experts were all very surprised that the car was going to be entered at all. It had only been around for 4 months.
Falkenlinger took 5th place overall, with the 904 finishing 2nd. By now, Ferry Porsche's nephew, Ferdinand Piech, was in charge of the race department, a man with a mission. Piech's frenzied work pace produced 6 new racing models in the next 4 years. For the 906, the 904's sheet steel and glass fibre design was immediately ditched in favour of the more familiar tubular steel construction. Soundproofing was not a priority.
This car had a 6-cylinder air-cooled engine, obviously, as always, produced around about 200 horsepower, and made its debut at the Daytona 24 Hours in January or February of 1966, where it actually finished 6th overall and won its class, the 2-litre class. Pretty wonderful start. The car then went on, ran through the season, and in fact, they entered 5 cars for the Targa Florio, the tortuous 75-kilometre circuit in Sicily. And the car went on to win the race overall in the hands of Hervé Muller and Willy Mares. This car is not that winning car, but it's identical.
In Stuttgart, Piech's racing ambitions continued to force the pace.
It was only made possible by a close cooperation. I must stress that the tasks were in no way as complex as they are today. But the motivation, the pioneering spirit was there, and so we got results. There was pressure, of course, but above all, enthusiasm.
Lightweight materials such as magnesium and titanium were employed for the 910.
The sister car to this 910 Porsche actually won the 2-litre class in Le Mans in 1967 in the hands of Joe Siffert and Hans Hermann. It also finished a very credible 5th place behind the might of Ferrari and Ford. Let's just see how it goes.
In '67, a radical lightweight 910 version won every major hill climb event in Europe. The 907, also a close cousin of the 910, made its debut at Le Mans. Hans Hermann and the Swiss Joe Siffert brought the little 2-litre car in 5th behind the 7-litre Ford and 5-litre Ferraris. '68 was Vic Elford's year. He started with a win on the Monte Carlo rally. Literally within a few days, Elford was in Florida for the 24 Hours of Daytona. The main opposition was from the Ford GT40s, particularly in the hands of a young Belgian, Jackie Ickx. But the Fords proved unreliable, and Elford and Jochen Nierpasch led a 907 procession into the first 3 places. 4 of the 8-cylinder 907s were entered for the Targa Florio. Elford had a puncture on the opening lap.
I actually started the second lap. There are differences of timing, but somewhere between 16, 18, 19 minutes behind the leading car. And I thought, well, that's it. You know, that's the end of the race as far as winning it is concerned, but I'm damn well going to have the lap record. So I started off after the lap record, which I broke every single lap. Then I went back and was looking over Helmut Bott's shoulder at the timing. I said, Helmut, we can still win this race. He calculated and said, okay, maybe you're right. So Maglielli came in after 3 laps instead of 4, and I did the last 3. And I actually took the lead on the last lap, but won. So when I crossed the line at the end, I had a very healthy old 2.5 minutes lead or so.
Despite these successes, Piëch was of course anxious to get his new car, the 908, into the fray. Hans Metzger was responsible for a brand new 3-litre engine.
When you think about it today, what we'd done in those days, in the space of a year, and it really makes me look back in amazement. What a wide range of engines and racing cars. And they're all actually successful, or became highly successful later on. We achieved all that with a very small team.
The 908's race debut was at Monza and was a technical disaster. The drivers reported rough, noisy engines and severe vibrations at over 7,000 RPM. Nürburgring in May was better, with Elford and Siffert narrowly beating Ickx in the Ford. Le Mans was a tougher test for the new cars. Despite 1.5 hours in the pits, Stomlin and Nierpasch came in 3rd behind a 907. But the race and the championship belonged to Pedro Rodriguez in the Gulf GT40. Homologation rules for 69 were relaxed. Just 25 cars had to be shown, not 50 as before. In secret and in a big hurry, Piëch forced a new 4.5-litre 12-cylinder model into production, the 917. The FIA duly inspected 25 cars at Zuffenhausen and pronounced them raceworthy.
First of all, the 917 came out at the Geneva show in 1969. And the first time I saw it was at the show, and I just fell in love with it because I'd always liked big cars.
Brian Redman wasn't over-enamoured.
I got into this thing, first time ever, and it had this giant windshield wiper, like that length, off a Boeing 707. And it's over on the left here, and the pits are on the right. And I started the engine, the mechanics are showing me what things are. And they said, okay, switch on the Viper. So I switched on the Viper and it went wow and flew off. It went right past Herr Bott into the pit. So I switched everything off, got out. Herr Bott said, Brian, why are you getting out? I said, Herr Bott, the windshield wipers come off. Brian, he says, go slowly.
It was actually slightly worse than anybody I think could have possibly imagined. The main problem was, of course, we had the 908 at that time, and Piëch was insistent we all got around to using the 917, which was a totally unsorted car. Anyway, we were forced into using it at Le Mans in 69 with Vic Elford, and there was another car with Stommelen and Arendt, I think.
A third 917, number 10, seen here in practice, was to be driven by Herbert Linger and John Wolf. Wolf later lost control on the first lap of the race and was killed. Having sorted out a scrutineer's objection to the mechanical aerofoil devices on the rear wings, the Porsche team, amongst them interested observer Steve McQueen, had high hopes. After an hour, Stommelen was temporarily in the pits with an oil leak, and Elford and Atwood took up the challenge. In fact, they then led the race from the 4th till the 21st hour.
I just felt that we should have won that race. In fact, the clutch did stop operating, but the gearbox was actually breaking in half and the whole thing was hanging down, and so, of course, we couldn't select gears. So that's why we did not finish.
A tremendous battle was then fought between Hans Hermann in a 908 Coupe and Jackie Ickx in the Ford GT40.
Dans le fond, la jeunesse, rien n'est impossible.
When you're young, nothing is impossible. Porsche had Hermann and Larousse in their team. I think they chose Hermann to finish the race for his experience. Maybe that was a mistake. And perhaps they should have chosen the younger man, as Larousse was at the time.
Comme Larousse à l'époque.
Ickx won by just 75 meters, the closest ever Le Mans finish between different makes. The factory team was disbanded at the end of the race for simple reasons of economy. And for 1970, the baton was picked up by John Wyer.
Porsche, who had won the World Championship in 1969, were going to be under British management with the support of Gulf Oil in the United States. My company, JW Automotive Engineering, had provided the principal competition to Porsche in 1968 and 1969, but it remained to be seen if this combination of our management, Porsche Engineering, and Gulf Oil could be forged into a winning team.
The 917, what can you say about this car? Just the sound of the name or the sight of the car brings up the hackles on the back of your neck in excitement. A car which every driver during the early 1970s would love to have driven. Here we have the engine. It's a flat 12, air-cooled engine, can you believe it? First time they produced a flat 12 engine. Has a fan down there in the middle. And I remember one day we're at the racetrack sitting in the pits and suddenly the fan just took off and went out through the bodywork. So let's take a look around here. This is the refueling system. In those days they used to refuel the car with churns of fuel, and we actually sat in the fuel tank on the side of the car. Our knees were right up tight to the steering wheel, and our feet, believe it or not, were in front of the center line of the front wheels. We must have been crazy. I just can't believe that we used to do those sort of things. But of course, we weren't so conscious of safety then, and the chance to drive a Porsche 917 was paramount, and so you drove it even if it only had 3 wheels on it. Well, this is it. This is the phenomenal 917. This is the car that I think is probably the car of the sports car era since the 1950s. This is the most unbelievable car. It's a car that probably meant more to me in my racing career. The first real sort of sophisticated sports car I ever drove. It's a flat 12, air-cooled engine, no turbochargers, just a nice straight flat 12 air-cooled engine, 4.5 litre depending on the year. And it was the main car for the 1970 and 71 series. Absolutely incredible to drive, very, very smooth, torquey engine. And even when I drive it today, it nearly brings tears to your eyes when you think about just what wonderful races and battles we used to have. People say, you don't have very good rear vision, do you? And you say, you didn't have to have rear vision because you're always in front. Oh, we're giving it some stick now as we go up the straightaway. This car did 246 miles an hour at Le Mans. Only doing about 160 now. Absolutely outstanding little car. So small, you cannot believe how small it is. 4-speed gearbox, down to second gear. Of course, being nearly 25 years old, the suspension is very, very soft, as they used to be in those days. So the car leans a lot as you're going around the corner. Hear that flat 12 engine go. Absolutely beautiful. These are moments to savor for any driver that drove in the early 70s. Quite a wonderful car, something none of us will ever forget. It really didn't have any vices. The only thing was that if you backed off in a corner, you were going sedan fast, but of course the car was inclined to go to a bit of an oversteer. It was a real driver's car. Nonetheless, the ultimate car in sports car racing at that time.
For 1970, John Wyer's Gulf Team 917s were up against Ferrari's new model, the 512S. Much to Wyer's surprise, he also had to contend with 2 more 917s allocated to the Austrian Porsche Salzburg team. The stage was set for an epic season, but some of the fiercest racing was in the Gulf team itself.
The rivalry between Seffert and Rodriguez was tremendous. They were both very, very aggressive drivers. I think maybe Rodriguez was actually a smoother driver and easier on the machinery because Seppi only had one speed. He was flat out.
New Gulf 908-3s appeared for the Targa, and the Rodriguez-Siffert battle raged on. A senior engineer at Porsche, on condition of anonymity, recounted an unexpected story from this period.
Piek and Bott were fanatical about weight saving and also aerodynamics. They said that the race cars should have no holes in them, that is, no air intakes that would interrupt the airflow. We knew that this was impossible, so we built intakes anyway, and then covered them over with the plastic bodywork. When everything became impossibly hot during testing, we would simply uncover the holes and save ourselves a lot of work.
Siffert and Redman won the Targa convincingly, with another 908-3 in second place. And so to Le Mans, where 8.917s were ranged against no fewer than 11 Ferrari 512s.
We were leading by 4 laps. That is 32 miles. And it was raining, it was a miserable race. And Siffert was engaged in a tremendous battle with Jackie Ickx, Ferrari team leader in the 512, and they were racing each other. And there we were with 4-lap lead. I mean, he should have just let him go, but that wasn't his nature.
Siffert blew his engine and was out. Atwood and Hans Hermann won the race, with Porsches in second and third places as well. On their 20th outing, Porsche had finally won Le Mans.
20 Jahre Rennen.
I've been racing for nearly 20 years now. And now that I've won this race, which is so important to us, the Le Mans 24 hours, I've decided to stop for good. I'm happy, I'm healthy, and I couldn't have hoped for a better ending.
But there was another Le Mans in 1970. Solar Productions' film of that name with Steve McQueen. Derek Bell and David Piper helped out.
Between our racing commitments, we'd drop in at Le Mans to help make the film. On this particular day when I had my accident, I went into Maison Blanche, at about 120 miles an hour, and the car sort of oversteered and hit the guardrail on the right-hand side, slid across the track, hit the guardrail on the left-hand side of the track, and the car just flew up in the air and broke in half and landed in a sort of pile of bits.
Did they actually use that sequence in the film?
No, the cameras were all turned off.
Piper lost a leg as a result of the crash.
Steve wanted to run with Siffert and I. So I was in front, and we put Steve behind in another 917, and Joe behind him in another 917, and we came out all the way down from Arnage, down through the fast curve there, and down into Whitehouse. And of course there, we actually wouldn't back off for the corner as Steve thought we would. And Steve, having the sort of balls that he had to hang in with us. And we got to the end of the shot, and we got out of the cars, you know, all laughing. Us, Joe and I were laughing like crazy. And Steve got out, and he's absolutely white, and his whole face was as white as his face mask. And as I'm going across the crown of the road, there is this cameraman lying in the middle of the road, on the dotted line in the middle of the road, with a camera, with a movie camera like this. And I flicked through at 150, probably not full speed, but as close as darn it. Came flicking out wide, and Joe flicked out behind me in the Porsche. And we get to the end of the run, and of course the director's standing there, and he said, "What was that run like?" And Joe said, "I think we nearly hit somebody. There's a cameraman in the middle of the road." So John Sturgis was the director at the time, and he calls up Steve, who's down with the cameraman on that particular, on the White House corner. He says, "Hey, Steve," he said, "come back up here a minute." And he said, "Well, what about the cameraman?" He said, "Well, I was the cameraman." And Steve was that sort of a person. I mean, he thought, that's where the camera should be, and I'll do it.
For many, the 1970 clash between the 917s and 512 Ferraris represents the finest expression of sports car racing yet seen.
Larry Wilson in 22. Porsche wins Le Mans.
But racing rules will always evolve, and the 917 made its final bow in 71. So, as the 3-litre regulations approached, a new era was also beginning for Porsche.
It was a family decision that we, as a family, would resign from the company to give the management a chance to develop. And we all, unanimously, believed that was right.
Weissach, a small town 15 miles south of Stuttgart. From 72 onwards, it achieved instant fame as the new headquarters of the Porsche race department. Back in America, the Can-Am series had been gaining momentum. For years, the 8-litre McLarens had been dominant. Roger Penske and his team driver Mark Donohue were looking for a way to beat them.
The arrangement between Penske Racing and Porsche was developed because both our company and Porsche wanted to win the Can-Am.
The first thing we wanted to do was to look at one of the cars. And so we at first thought that we were could be in some considerable trouble, and that perhaps Porsche had underestimated the capability of the McLaren racing car.
Donohue saw a car like this, the 5.5-litre 917 Spider. Although this car was an Inter-Serie Championship winner in Europe, the Can-Am McLarens were putting out over 750 horsepower. But Hans Metzger and Valentine Schaefer were busy at Weissach developing their secret weapon, a turbocharger. When the turbocharged 91710 first appeared, the McLaren Chevrolet and UOP Shadow teams were not prepared. Early indications were that Donohue and the Porsche would be unbeatable, but he was injured during testing. George Follmer took his place and proceeded to simply blow the doors off the McLarens, winning the Can-Am Championship with ease. 73 saw the ultimate development on this theme, the 1200 horsepower 91730, which gave Donohue the championship. But the world's first energy crisis threw the sport into turmoil.
My first assignment consisted of the unfortunate task of going to America and negotiating with the SCCA people to see whether Porsche could continue racing or not. The answer was no. We weren't allowed to take part anymore. Stuttgart reacted with an act of defiance, really, and said, okay, if they won't let us race, we'll at least go out with a bang. We'll go to Talladega in Alabama and challenge the closed-circuit world record.
Uprated to a staggering 1,500 horsepower, Donahue took the record to 221 miles per hour. Ferry Porsche's replacement as managing director was Dr. Fuhrmann, who decided to halt the more extreme products of the race department.
Of course, the company had always been in favor of motorsport, so it turned to a kind of motorsport that was more cost-effective, especially since there were changes afoot in terms of the racing rules.
The new thrust was towards production-based cars. Weissach was quick to take up the challenge. The first of these 911-based prototype race cars, known as Carrera RSRs, went to Peter Gregg's legendary Brumos racing team in Florida.
When 73 came around, and Peter was given a car by Porsche to race. There was two cars, one for Peter and one for Roger Penske's team with Mark Donahue and George Follmer. Daytona was the most important road racing event in the United States, and to be able to win that was a terrific thrill for me.
The winning car returned to Stuttgart and was widely admired. A win at Daytona had been completely unexpected. The RSR was perfect for customer racing. But in the tradition of continuous development, it was inevitable that Hans Metzger should continue his earlier researches.
Of course, it's true to say that we resurrected the turbocharger, which came from the 917 Turbo, in other words, the Can-Am car. But what Porsche started then, no one really could have foreseen that it would bear such fruit.
Well, we're out in the very, very first turbocharged 911. Instead of having like 220 horsepower, we're out there and we've got like 500, although of course it's only a 2.1 litre engine. 4-speed gearbox, quite difficult to get the revs right for it, but when you're right, it really is right and it really whistles away. Here we go, we're on song a bit now, and away she goes. Car bounces around a lot, quite a lot over the bumps. This is due to the fact that you've got a lot of weight at the back, and this has to be counteracted spring and shock absorber-wise throughout the whole car, because the actual weight distribution isn't exactly what one would call ideal. As soon as I tuck into the apex of the corner, start to feed the power on, the tail starts to come out. Initially, he's got a very nice neutral steer, and then the power starts to come, and out goes the tail. Of course, this was very much a compromise car at this time because a lot of work had to be done because Porsche actually hadn't built a car with so much power in the 911 chassis. And it took a lot of sorting out. And I remember driving them. They were wonderful to drive. And when you actually got it right, it was such a tonic for you because you actually felt the car biting. It was the first of the monsters. They were animal-like, these cars.
These early 911 turbos finally evolved into a Group 5 contender, the 935, first introduced in '76. This was the so-called Silhouette series, but these cars might better be described as caricatures of their road-going relatives. While the 935s continued to be supremely competitive until the early 80s, there was a desire at Weissach to produce a contender for the Group 6 World Championship for sports cars, the 936.
The car was built under a veil of secrecy. As far as I know, it was even kept a secret from Dr. Porsche at the beginning. The car was built ad hoc, so to speak, The chassis came from the 917, had a new aluminium frame, and of course new bodywork. As time was pressing, there was no opportunity to take the car into the wind tunnel. It was just a case of using the past experience we had to put a car together as we thought it should look. It went relatively well.
The 936 did indeed go relatively well. At the 76 Le Mans, his virtually new car, driven by Jackie Ickx and Gijs van Lennep, scored Porsche's third outright win, trouncing the Renault Alpine team. Again in 77, Porsche wheeled out a pair of twin turbocharged 936s, one for Ickx and Henry Pescarolo, and another for Jürgen Barth and Hurley Haywood. Ickx and Pescarolo's car lost to Conrad after just 4 hours.
So Jackie Ickx then changed to our car, Hurley Haywood's and mine. Because we were so far behind with a broken injection pump, we had to drive flat out, like no one has ever driven at Le Mans before. And that was the real problem.
The race will be remembered for Jackie Ickx's virtuoso display of night driving, consistently lapping inside the course record and moving steadily through the field from 41st place to the lead. 46 minutes from the end, the 936 developed a hole in one piston, and Jürgen Barth nursed the car to victory over the last 2 laps.
Winning that race was just, you know, it was amazing. I look back on it, and I really didn't do too much. I mean, I was sort of the token American that was asked to do it, and you know, I drove maybe 4 or 5 hours out of the 24 hours, but I did drive it, and it was still a win.
Derek Bell was driving for the opposition.
Renault, to me, were on a mission. Their mission was to win Le Mans. Whereas with Porsche, it was an annual job, and it was just a routine.
But meanwhile, something was stirring in the African bush. The Swede, Bjorn Valdegard, had for years been an important member of the Works rally team, but he never managed to win the testing safari rally. Back at Weissach, Norbert Singer had developed some interesting 935 derivations, including the 1.4-litre Baby and the Moby Dick.
It was a 3.2-litre twin-turbo engine. It had 4 valves and was one of the first 4-valve cars that was water-cooled. It had huge wheels, 19-inch wheels at the rear. It was really quite spectacular. Its speed was measured in Le Mans at 365 kilometers an hour. It was very fast indeed.
I saw my first sports car race in March of 1981, and for the first time I saw a vehicle called a Porsche 935. When that sucker was running at full song in a race and they shifted gears while the flames would shoot out 3 or 4 feet, I'd never seen anything like it.
Well, this is one of those real experiences that very few of us have been fortunate enough to ever do. This has to be one of the 2 most awesome cars ever built by Porsche. One being the 917-30, which was their Can-Am car. The other is this, the 935. 4-speed, 800 horsepower turbo, 3.5-litre engine. It's absolutely incredible in its power, as you can see. Very noisy, but it's outrageous in its power. When you turn in, you have to be very gentle on the turn in. You have like a neutral, then an understeer as the boost comes, and then when it really arrives, you then get an oversteer. Quite unbelievable. The brakes are unbelievable as well. What with the power and the brakes, you've got an outrageous car. Here we go through the right, through the left, feel the surge of power. On the brakes, on the power, picking it up. Here he goes through the corner, out we go, into a bit of an oversteer as we come out. Down here we have the boost on. I can adjust anything from 700 to 800 horsepower at will, just by turning this knob up and down. Hear that power and the boost coming on, it's really pulling now as I go up the straight, pulling out about 170 miles an hour. Really going like crazy. Absolutely wonderful.
In all, the 935s notched up a phenomenal 129 major victories in Europe and America between 76 and 81. Fuhrmann elected to send a team of 3 924s to the 1980 Le Mans, hoping for a class win. Barth and Schurte came in an astonishing 6th place, despite a damaging overnight encounter with a rabbit. Meanwhile, there were serious plans to discontinue the 911.
I remember very clearly spending some time with Mr. Bott in his office, and he had a chart on the wall with some bars that designated the anticipated development expenditures for the various models. And the 924 ran on forever, and the 928 ran on forever, and the 911 stopped in 1981. And I still remember grabbing a marker crayon and walking up to that chart on Mr. Bott's wall and just extending the bar for the 911 on out, and I say, we're not going to stop this. And that's really how we decided that we would go ahead and continue it.
But the new president wasn't content with simply saving the 911. Weissach had decided to run another team of 924 road cars for Le Mans in 81.
Suddenly I asked them quite impulsively, tell me, what are the chances of winning? Well, they said, there's no chance of winning the race when we will be confronted there by thoroughbred racing cars. And I remember just pausing for a moment and saying to them, look, folks, I'm going to explain something to you. As long as I am going to be president of this organization, we will never go to any race without the objective of winning.
There was only one option. The faithful 936s were again taken to Le Mans.
I never saw the car until it turned up on practice day, and I went out on, I think, my second lap. Was the quickest lap I've ever done at Le Mans in anything. And of course, Jackie got on pole, and we led the race all but a few laps for the whole race. They never even had to lift the engine cover up the whole 24 hours. It was wonderful, and we won the race.
At the conclusion of the race, all of the racing rules were changed. Open cars were no longer going to be permitted. They had to have a monocoque, aluminum structure with a closed car, and completely different rules governing fuel consumption and thus the whole engine arrangement and management.
So Schutz gave the team at Weissach the go-ahead for a new car, to be called the 956.
It wasn't really an evolution from an earlier car, from a different racing car. It was actually built up from scratch, in accordance with these new regulations. We already had a very good engine, a very efficient engine, and Group C was totally geared to fuel-efficient engines. In other words, to use as little fuel as possible.
With this engine, we'd won Le Mans the previous year. That was the only component that was tried and tested. All the rest was new. New gearbox, new chassis, new bodywork.
I went to discuss with Professor Bott my contract for 1982 in the 956. He said to me, Derek, he said, we will be building the car. It's a monocoque car. We've never built a monocoque chassis before. And he said, we'll be building a ground effect car. We've never built a ground effect car. But we've never been wrong before.
Rothman's Porsche team cars line up in formation, led by Bell, who once again partnered Jackie Ickx. The crowd was delirious. This was Bell's 3rd Le Mans victory and Ickx's 6th. Porsche, in fact, won every class. Meanwhile, the factory had received a visit from a certain Englishman.
They had a huge amount of experience in turbocharging, and therefore it was a logical port of call for any Grand Prix team looking to become competitive.
And Ron is a very, very knowledgeable and very clever individual. And Ron managed to put together a coalition. I would say he really did it with mirrors at the beginning.
The strategy that I adopted was to first commission the design of the engine, and during the period that led up to the commencement of the production program, which was round figures 6 months, find the balance of the funding to bring the engine into reality.
The McLaren factory today, and an example of the Targ engine from '86. But its conception wasn't easy.
Hans Metzger, engine designer from Porsche, and John Barnard from McLaren were in charge of the project. They had lots of arguments. We're talking about high-caliber technicians here, oversensitive people, and both of them claimed that he would develop the engine.
Monza opened the '83 season, and the factory were embarrassed to lose out to Reinhold Joest's Privateer 956, driven by Bob Wallach and Thierry Boutsen. Le Mans turned into a titanic struggle between the X-Bell car and that of Hurley Haywood, Al Holbert and Vern Schuppen.
Derek was driving like a madman because he could smell blood. He knew he had a chance of catching us at that stage. And our car literally seized up going across the finishing line, and we won the race, I think, by 56 seconds.
And here we have the 956 all ready for the Le Mans 24-hour race. This is actually how we ran the car with the long tail. It's a 2.6 six-cylinder horizontally opposed engine. The cylinder heads themselves are actually water-cooled, and the engine block is air-cooled. Over here is a turbocharger, on the other side is a turbocharger. And these both work with the intercoolers separately, independently on either side. And in fact, we have 2 gauges telling us the information. There is a little knob inside the cockpit, and we can actually turn that up to give us anything from 600 horsepower to 750, depending on what we require. We come back down the car. Here, of course, are the shock absorbers, and here are the famous Porsche anti-roll bar. Not very big, but there they are, very strong. This is a little oil cooler for the gearbox, just to keep the temperature down the gearbox when it gets very, very hot in extreme conditions. For example, driving at excess of 220 miles an hour every lap down the Dirol-Mulsanne straight. On the tail of the car, of course, the air flows down through here and some of it down through there, but the air flows over here and is picked up by louvers on the back, and it brings air through these little ducts down into the braking area to help cool everything. Then we come along a little bit further down the side. This is where the exhausts come out. That's hence the rather strange noise the car makes, because you only actually hear, if you're standing by the car, you only hear 3 cylinders firing at one time. 3 on that side and 3 on this with a 6. For Le Mans, because of the high speed that we attain there, we don't want too much ground effect. So we reduce it by having a rather squarer front on the car and a little bit less downforce underneath to stop it being sucked on the road so much.
The 956 won 27 World and Driver Championship races between '82 and '86. By '84, the Porsche-powered McLaren was en song. Their success was phenomenal. Niki Lauda took the World Championship and Alain Prost again in '85 and '86.
It was just a partnership that worked, and although, of course, the performance of the engine was a critical factor in the success, so was the way that the partnership developed. If any one individual in Porsche deserves the credit for the success of the TAG turbo engine, then it's most certainly Professor Bott.
1986, and the 959 road car provided the basis for Porsche's Paris-Dakar entry. With 2.8-litre twin-turbo engines and detuned from a potential 400 horsepower to allow for poor quality fuel, these were sophisticated machines. René Metger won the event for a second time, with Jackie Ickx 2 hours behind in second place. While the 956 had been cutting a swathe through all opposition in Group C, it was not eligible for the IMSA series. American safety rules specified that the pedal box, and therefore the driver's feet, should not be ahead of the front axle. So Porsche introduced the 962 with an extended wheelbase. Alvin Springer's Andile company was responsible for most preparations, and one of their first customers was Al Holbert, sponsored by Lowenbrau.
Of course, the Lowenbrau 962 was my IMSA car. And of course, it always brings memories of Al Holbert back, who was such a wonderful man. But driving that car was wonderful. It was great to slide 800 horsepower around corners. That, to me, was what IMSA was about, was great races. We didn't have that sort of thing in the World Sports Car Championship because eventually it got down to endurance and who could really get their computer working better.
For Group C, the 962C was introduced for the 85 season. Hans-Joachim Stuck, in his first year with Porsche, won the World Championship. With Bell and Al Hulbert, he went on to win Le Mans in 86 and 87.
Until 85, I never really knew why Porsche was always so successful there. When I was allowed to drive the Porsche myself, it all became perfectly clear. Porsche was always better prepared than anyone else, and the car was always better developed for Le Mans. With a 962, you could take your hands off the wheel on the straight. In all other cars, you would sit cramped up behind the wheel, and you really had to work hard at staying on the track.
Well, this really is the ultimate Porsche. There's never been anything like it, and it'll be a long time probably before there's anything like it again. It's absolutely incredible car. It's the epitome of everything that I've driven so far, and I'm sure I'll never probably ever race anything more sophisticated, more amazing to drive. It has immense power. It has 800 horsepower. If you need it, we only run at Le Mans with like 600 odd. But it has a lot of power. As you can see, tremendous brakes very, very well. In fact, accelerates from 0 to 100 miles an hour and back to 0 again in about 6 seconds. Pretty impressive. 5-speed gearbox. Woo. It's a little bit, tires just aren't getting warm yet. You nearly need to give the tires time to get warm. You'll notice how flat the car is, how very stable it is to the corners. There's no roll. Very, very stable. This is because we run very, very heavy springs. Probably 6,000 or 7,000 pound springs on the car. This keeps the car very, very stable indeed. And of course you can change direction as you saw through that little bit of wheel spin coming out. Probably the most successful car that there's ever been at Le Mans, the Porsche 962. Started off as the 956. And to everybody that drove it, it has a very special place in their hearts. When I got in it just now, it's just like getting back into my old house, getting back into an old pair of shoes. You just feel so at home with it. It's just the most wonderful, lovely car to drive.
Given such extraordinarily reliable and viceless cars, the spotlight inevitably returns to the driver's abilities. Who was the best of this era?
Jackie, to me, is the greatest sports car driver I've ever driven with. All he wanted to do was win, which is the way to be. To me, he was very much like Ayrton Senna.
In my life, I think the greatest performances by my co-drivers during the endurance races were Andretti and Redman at Ferrari, Derek Bell on various occasions at Porsche, and Jochen Mass.
You know, one of the guys that I, really thought was terrific in these long-distance races was Al Hulbert. Al is no longer with us, unfortunately, but I mean, Hans Stuck is good.
Derek isn't just a great person as a driver, but also as a human being. He's a true cosmopolitan, not a typical Englishman, and he's the best driving partner anyone could possibly have.
As drivers with Porsche, we enjoyed such extraordinary success. I mean, not only me, but Jochen Mass, Hans Stuck, Derek. All of us have benefited from this extraordinary experience, this determination, this dynamic. I think that was our great good fortune, which really was the most essential thing.
Porsche took 7 successive Le Mans wins between 81 and 87, and 3 more at Daytona.
For some people, a Porsche is nothing much more than a fur coat. I mean, it's just something you wear not something you drive. But there is a distinct market niche for whom the performance of the car is important. You know, there's a saying here in the United States that's very old, that if you win on Sunday, you sell on Monday.
Perhaps this was the philosophy that led Schutz to sanction a new IndyCar contender, the 2708.
The mood seemed to be, we are the greatest anyway, so let's go to the States and we'll show them what we're made of. Also, the sales in the States seemed to need some support. Obviously, it was thought that it would be a rapid undertaking. But things turned out differently. Porsche tried very hard. They tried everything that was possible. Today, I'm absolutely convinced that we could have been successful had we had a bit more patience.
The Indy project was suspended in '91, as was involvement with the unsuccessful footwork Formula One car. With no works team in Group C, perhaps the race department is in decline.
Porsche is in a very enviable position. The whole Porsche motorsport structure, on a worldwide level, has a very wide, solid basis made up of many, many thousands of customers who take part in motorsports with Porsche products.
The Carrera Cup at national level and the International Super Cup Series ensure a continuing motorsport presence for Porsche. But it doesn't stop there.
I looked upon 1994 as being the last year that I was going to do the Le Mans 24-hour race. After all, I'd done it 24 times in the previous 25 years. Got on the front row, which was a great fillip for me in my last year. And of course, I had this wonderful sort of minute or two of actually leading the race.
The Dower team had converted their 962C into a road car, and it was therefore eligible for the GT class.
The GT class was our goal at Le Mans this year. I think deep down in our hearts, we sort of said, well, maybe there might be a chance to win the race overall. It was a grueling race, and Toyota would sort of mirror what we did. As we would speed up, they would speed up. As we would slow down, they would slow down.
The Dower team, helped perhaps by their GT status, overcame the Group C opposition to win outright. While the Zuffenhausen factory continues to produce the immortal 911, dreams take shape at Weissach.
There's a magical bond between stylists and racing machinery. There's something special there that appeals to the designer. He allows himself to be inspired by it, to go for new proportions, new ideas.
The Boxster is clearly related to James Dean's 550 Spider.
You mustn't forget that that car was actually quite exotic. It was a racing car which could be bought direct from Porsche. It wasn't a mass product, and it wasn't a sports car in the usual sense of the word, with perfect workmanship. It was a racing car for the street.
Oh, I just feel sorry Factory not continue it, because in racing, like in any sport, you have to be steady practicing and steady long with, because the rest people not sleep.
At this time, the future of racing at Porsche does indeed look undecided. But high in the Austrian Alps lives a man who is known for his clarity of vision.
Ich bin der Meinung, dass es wäre schlecht, wenn nicht
I believe that it would be bad if it did not continue, because I would say that cars would become nothing more than domestic appliances if they weren't entered into competitions. Just as in athletics, which has always been supported by competitions, where it's man against man, in this case it's car against car.
Auto gegen Auto.
Turbo coming in, really picking up some pace. And of course the whole thing about driving these cars is predicting when the power's going to arrive and therefore get the line right. Well, we spun it. What about that? I hope they don't use this bit in the film.